And good evening. I'm Ted L. Gunderson, retired Senior Special Agent in charge of the FBI Los Angeles Division, 27-year veteran of the FBI in the old days, not the new days. Today is February the 9th, 2006. And you folks had better hold on to your britches because you're going for a real good ride with Bob Fisher. Bob Fisher is from the East Coast. And Bob, welcome to this show, whatever the show is. I'm not sure.
All right. Well,
but Bob, you have a fantastic background. You have been going over some of the details of your discovery and your research, and I am unbelievably fascinated with what you've come up with. To begin, Bob, tell me about yourself. Where were you raised?
Okay, just a simple guy born in Missouri, St. Louis area of Missouri, and one of 10 kids. Grew up Catholic, obviously.
No, it wasn't a sexy Protestant, but a Catholic. Right?
Catholic, yeah, and had you know, a pretty normal, sane, stable upbringing, and had at the point of time when I left high school. Had my private pilot's license, had that in my senior year. After I left high school, I had entered into a program to get my airframe and power plant mechanics license. For a period of time, I worked for charter aircraft operations doing mechanics. And then I decided to go back to school and got a background in biology and biochemistry and started working at the University of Missouri at their medical school in the various departments. I had worked in the biochemistry department, pharmacology department, and the pathology departments over a span of about 6 years. And then got hired by DuPont, came out to the East Coast in 1982, and started in life science research program that they had for their pharmaceutical division, and was with them up until 1997. And so that was essentially the extent of my professional, technical background.
And Bob, we've been going over this material that you came to California with, and tell us, how did you come across this information? How did you develop it within your own mind, and how did you come up with this research?
Well, I sort of like fell into it backwards is the best way to describe it. After my departure from DuPont, one of the jobs that I was able to pick up was working for a bank courier service, and some of the assignments were very long distances at night, driving from Wilmington, Delaware to Chase Bank in Manhattan, 2-hour drive up and back, and you just have a lot of time to sit and think, and things started coming to me about patterns of numbers, and wasn't something that I normally would do. I didn't have any real fascination with mathematical puzzles or anything up until that time. I had used mathematics in my job, but just in a utility kind of way. Never had any real draw to it. But I guess that there was some sort of influence, external influence on me to, you know, start paying attention to little mathematical details, and I started puzzling it together. And this was about 3 years prior to 9/11 that this began, and so I had started to think that these bits and pieces may be part of a system that would be a mathematical language, and I was approaching it in that direction, thinking that, you know, this might be a good basis for a mathematical language. When 9/11 happened, I thought, you know, that, you know, like all Americans, that this was a major travesty perpetrated by Al-Qaeda and the Muslim extremists on America, and you know, I only considered it like everybody else did, or most everybody else, I should say. And it
Not me.
Okay, well, that's true. And I was part of the naive masses. If you want to call a silent majority, there was a naive majority out there as well I was a member of.
They're still there.
Yeah, well, in any case, they lost one member. At about 6 months after 9/11, I had begun looking at this from a perspective of some mathematical coincidences with what I had observed previously, and some friends had actually encouraged me to look at it further. And what emerged was a definite mathematical pattern was occurring with these attacks and other attacks. Prior to that, there was some indications of a mathematical pattern, starting with the bombing of the Kobar Towers in '96, and then the African embassy bombings in '98, and then the Flight 990 in 1999, and the USS Cole the following year in 2000, and then leading up to 2001. And I thought that this was a pattern that the Arabic Muslim people were using as part of some greater plan. And I investigated it and put together a report that I submitted to the NSA.
National Security Agency.
Yes, I put together an 80-page report that they reviewed and appreciated, and sent me back a letter acknowledging. And
well, that's good. At least they acknowledged they received it.
And then they encouraged me to pass it on to other agencies, which I passed on to the CIA. And one aspect of it pertains to the celestial mechanics and geophysical parameters of the Earth, and its spin and its wobbles, and it is the Naval Observatory that keeps track of such things for keeping things on track for the GPS satellite system.
Did the CIA respond?
CIA did not respond.
Oh, I wonder why.
I think that George Tenet had other things on his plate. In any case, thinking that these factors that involve the Earth's mechanics might be something that they may be helpful with, or they may actually appreciate learning about, I approached the Naval Observatory and had a discussion with people there for a period of time, and then all of a sudden they shut down communication with me altogether.
Did you see them physically, or just by correspondence?
This was correspondence by phone and by email. And then, so I have those emails on disk, so I'd have a record of that.
What was their reaction? Was it positive, negative, or they just quit communicating with you?
Well, initially it was amazement, and then interest, and then when I started hitting upon things that, corresponded to reality, they pondered it, and they got back to me, and then after about a week, back and forth, then they shut it down.
Never heard from them again.
They would not respond to anything. Okay. Little did I know that that was in Dick Cheney's backyard.
Physically.
Naval Observatory is in Dick Cheney's backyard. So,
Dick Cheney being the Vice President of the United States of America.
And of other organizations.
Yes.
Yes, the much more significant organizations. So, like a lemming, like the rest of us, I just was totally in the dark, and it wasn't until about 8 months ago that I happened to be driving along one day and scanned up and down the dial, and found a radio program by, I'm trying to think of his name.
Alex Jones.
Alex Jones, thank you. And I listened to it, and my jaw dropped open, and I realized that I had been a fool.
Then it all came together?
After listening to a few of his shows, it started to sink in that this was a reality, and that this was all perpetrated by the very people that I was trying to address and bring attention to. And so it allowed me to understand, too, their behavior and how they interacted with me.
Well, their behavior certainly accelerated your thinking, though, didn't it?
Yes. It also
particularly when you heard Alex Jones.
Yes, and it also shut off
Good for you, Alex. We're proud of you.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Alex. It also shut down my communication with them altogether from my side. I no longer had any interest in speaking with them ever again.
But then that gave you, what you had to figure, that gave you credibility then.
Well, it gave me the impetus to think that, you know, let's look at this and see what actually is further in the rabbit hole and how deep it went. And I went deeper and deeper, and I think with the presentation you'll find just how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Okay, you want to start?
Sure.
Let's explain what we have here on the screen.
Okay.
Itinerary coding shells. What does that mean?
Okay, it seems
Looks like a whole series of eggs, one within the other.
That's what it is. Essentially, there are organizations that have, throughout time, essentially have an agenda that they've been following, and it is rooted back all the way back to the Knights Templar and their founding. And
Knights Templar being what?
they are the knights that essentially regarded themselves as the children of, or the progeny of Christ, and that they were a part of a privileged line of rulers that were intended to rule the world. Okay.
What year would this have been?
That would be, the founding of it would have been 1118, and essentially they had put together a crusade to go to the Holy Land, ostensibly under the cover of being the hospital knights who were to care for and help facilitate travelers to the Holy Land that was newly opened from the Muslim world. But their true agenda was to find relics and artifacts underneath King Solomon's temple that would verify that they in fact were the progeny that originated with Christ, and that would give them the validity to come back and have leverage in a political sense in the medieval world.
Okay, go on with your story.
Okay. Essentially, while they were there in their time period in trying to find these relics, they interfaced with the Muslim community there, who had a very articulate development of a mathematical system, and they picked this up from them, and they have employed that mathematics in their architecture and in other aspects of their activities across time. And the culmination of it in more recent centuries is that they have an itinerary essentially dictating how things are to transpire and a script to be played out according to this mathematical code.
Their game plan.
Their game plan. And when you come up to the time period when Isaac Newton and other people of his period, which is very well developed in a book by Robert Lomas, and essentially we think of Isaac Newton as the great scientist. Well, he was also practiced the black arts at the same time. He retained his interest in alchemy at the same time as being renowned as a mathematician and an astronomer. This was true of a number of the people of his colleagues who were Masons at the time, and this was the founding of the Age of Reason. So there was a marriage between alchemy and science in a way that they're employing.
Alchemy and what? And who?
And science. Science and alchemy were merged together.
Right.
In their Masonic tradition. And this mathematical development had two parallels, one that pertains to physics and chemistry and things that we know today as, you know, our technological society, and the other was a covert code that was developed in terms of the Masonic tradition's interest in controlling political and social forces.
A secret society?
Yes.
Within a secret society?
Within a secret society within a secret society.
Right.
Okay. They are very, very hierarchical, and if you take a look at the Masonic structure, the average Mason elevates himself to about the 3rd degree, and most of the Masonic work that is done are very honorable and worthwhile endeavors in the community, and most Masons have no idea what's going on at the top. And when you get through all the levels up to the 33rd degree level, where the real power resides, there is a retention of a ritual and tradition that dates all the way back to the Sumerian period prior to the Egyptian civilization, and their acknowledgement of the gods and goddesses of that Sumerian period. And that is at the core of their ritual and tradition, and it is directive of their behavior and where they're going today.
So you read this book?
This and the other book that is helpful is understanding how the tradition of the Knights Templar had come over from Europe to the United States, or I should say to America. And this book here by William Mann is very useful in understanding how that tradition had been transplanted from Europe through Nova Scotia, and the movement of the Knights Templar and their treasure to Nova Scotia through Henry Sinclair in the 1440s, and that is a date that will have a number that is recurring in the code. But
the year 1440.
Well, the number 1440 will
okay,
be
not the year.
Well, that is the year that ostensibly there was a movement of the Knights Templar treasure from Europe to Nova Scotia. Yes.
Okay, and then what happened after that? Reading these books brought this to light and started making you put the pieces together. Is that right?
That's right. Okay, and each book, these and other books, each have clues spread among them. There is no one book that has it all put together in one place in terms of this itinerary code that they're working from. But picking up the bits of evidence here and there, it patches together, and you'll see how well it patches together.
Go.
Okay. Well, this itinerary that they have is essentially a script that they're following, and their activities pertain to acting out their accomplishments or their aims at points in time that are regarded as permissible.
And their future acts.
And their future acts. So this is something that not only gives you an understanding of the past, but it also gives you a handle on what's going to happen in the future. Okay. And this code is embedded in a marriage, going back again to this idea that there was a marriage between alchemy and real science. They have taken that idea and had addressed the earth and its movement and the celestial sphere, the stars and such, as a reflection of that mathematical code.
Explain alchemy.
Alchemy is essentially different things to different people. The original intent prior to chemists working with materials in order to create new things, there was the belief that you could take one substance and turn it into gold, and there was interest in creating wealth through this process of transmuting other materials into gold. More recent definitions of alchemy are presented in the sense of transforming the inner person. And so, as I say, alchemy means different things to different people, but they are subjective endeavors.
And for your purposes, they mean what?
Essentially, that is the platform by which their subjective spiritual how should I say, world comes together and is married with the real objective world.
And the sciences.
And the sciences, right. So their use of mathematics and the sciences have been following two parallel paths throughout time.
And what do we have here? Let's explain this.
Okay. There are certain things that they have observed in nature that are beyond expectation. And an example of that would be, in an analogy, would be the diameter of the moon is just perfect so that when you have an eclipse, it just exactly blocks out the sun. Now, the moon could have been a variety of diameters. It could have been a variety of distances from the Earth. It could be going at various angles relative to Earth, but it is in orbit such that it is a perfect size at the right distance that it actually blocks out the sun. Now, the odds of that are very, very small unless there's some helping hand from a supernatural being to accomplish that. They would look at something like that in a sense of being instructive and looking at that to see, why should we pay attention to that? Why are we drawing our attention to that? Physical things like that have led to the understanding that there are other kind of amazing coincidences between mathematics and reality. For instance, the Earth has geophysical forces that cause it to wobble, and they have a variety of periods of time that they act through. The shortest precession cycle, or wobble, is 432 days long, and that's the Chandler cycle. And okay, and that's...
Let's start in the center there. What does the center mean, mathematically and geometric code?
This is a figurative center, or core.
Right there.
Yeah, this is a figurative core. This is the code system itself. It's mathematical and geometric in its nature, and it would take a whole separate presentation to get into the depth of that. But
is this the core of the Earth?
No, I mean, it's just, I'm just drawing it here as a figurative core of the itinerary code.
Right,
okay. And this is reflected throughout the shells. And one of the amazing things with these forces that cause the wobbles and the durations that they...
You're saying that the Earth wobbles?
In more than one way.
Right.
You have 3 or 4 different wobbles going on simultaneously. It's sort of like one of those rides in Disneyland where you're going 6 different directions at the same time. Okay, but these wobbles are very slow in their progression, and some of them are extremely slow in their progression. So the shortest one being the Chandler cycle, and that's only 432 days long. And
what does that mean, 432 days long?
To make a full circuit of one revolution of wobble. Okay, just like you would have one turn in one day, one duration of this cycle going 360 degrees throughout its wobble is 432 days period. Now, does
that mean that it wobbles one direction and the others wobble another direction?
It's a circular
wobble.
Wobble.
Okay.
Yeah. Each of these are like a circular or a tilt wobble. The Chandler wobble is just a very short length, being only about about 30 feet long. But it's important in terms of GPS technology, because the Naval Observatory has to keep track of it to keep the satellites and the GPS ground system synchronized together. So this very minor cycle does have a real impact in terms of today's technology. The nutation cycle is another precession or wobble, and it lasts 18 years. And I'm presenting these values here in a way that I'm trying to accentuate the fact that there is a mathematical relationship between these, not just that they happen to be these numbers, but these numbers relate to each other mathematically in very unique ways. The nutation cycle is induced by the moon going around the Earth, and that wobble being 18.6 years is very amazingly, if you take 4.32 and square it, you get 18.6624. Likewise, if you take 432 and multiply it by 60, you get the zodiac precession cycle, which lasts 25,920 years. So
when you say 25,920, you mean it starts over again after that?
Right. This keeps going on, and it takes 2,160 years to go through one phase of the zodiac. That's what this ecliptic or zodiac precession cycle is. We've just entered into the age of Aquarius, and we'll be in that for another 2,160 years. So each of these ages have certain reflective meanings in terms of their ritual, in their mysticism, in their mythology, and it's also reflected in this mathematics.
How about this obliquity, the tilt? That's the way it tilts?
The Earth tilts, and it ranges in between 22 degrees and 24 degrees in its axis relative to the sun. And so it doesn't keep a constant tilt. It varies over this period of 40,000 years.
Are you saying that these various, the Chandler, the nutation, and so forth, are all acting at the same time then?
Yes, they're acting at the same time.
Well,
yes.
now how can that be? One is on an angle one way, the other one is wiggling the other way, I mean, that's very difficult to understand or to believe.
Well, it's hard to probably conceive of, but astronomers keep track of it, and just as they keep track of the Chandler cycle for keeping GPS systems on track, they keep track of these others, and making adjustments for the others is not, they don't have to make the adjustments quite as frequently, but they do occur, and they're very well documented.
So geophysical is this particular. So are you saying that the brown or the core on the inside the Earth is one that wiggles? And
green is the outer surface.
The green is the outer surface,
and the brown is the core or the inner.
So are you saying that the brown or the core on the inside the Earth is one that wiggles and vibrates?
Yes, the whole of the Earth, right?
But the whole Earth does at the same time, yeah. Okay.
Right.
And then what about the Earth's surface?
Now the Earth's surface has a transition from nature providing the mathematical code or to follow, where man takes over and starts to reflect that code. And this happens with the architecture that the Masons have employed in their construction of cathedrals and other monuments around the world. The pyramids are the most famous example of a reflection of the application of these code values into architecture. And cathedrals and everything that we see from the period of medieval and Renaissance Europe, when they were Freemasons were responsible for that building period, up to and including today, with much of the monuments that they have constructed as well. In recent years,
yeah, you're going to show some examples.
Oh yes,
as we go on.
As we go on, and then in recent years, in the last 50 or 60 years, they have taken this application of architecture and employing this mathematical system to the aeronautical level.
They being
the Skull and Bones organization and the 33rd Degree Masons.
Knights Templar?
I imagine that there are various divisions within the organization. There are many divisions within the 33rd Degree Masonry umbrella that are involved in this, yes.
Do you think what you're telling me now and what you're going to tell me is in the next hour or so, hour and a half, 2 hours, is part of their secret information that they give to their members?
Only at the very top. you don't pass this on to a third degree master mason.
That's my point.
Yeah, they have no clue about
What
this.
you're saying is you think that you've come up with the secrets of the 33rd degree Masons, information about their activities and some of the secrets that they hold within their own organization. Is that what you're saying now?
Yes, they and the skull
And
and
that's what
bones.
you're going to deal with in the next hour, 2 hours?
Yes.
Very interesting. Okay, keep going.
Like I
Now,
say,
let's talk about this aeronautical then.
like
How does that apply to this situation?
well, our aviation system is very young and relative to history, but they've been in control of it from the very inception up until this very day. And there are aspects of the Federal Aviation Airway system that is a reflection of the code. And I'll give examples of that.
What code now?
This would be a reflection of the code that we see on these other levels at the Earth core and at the surface. The same
Okay.
code. The same code.
Now, how far does that extend from the Earth's surface, the aeronautical,
As
the light blue?
as high as airplanes fly, and then we transition into the celestial level where planets and stars become involved with this as well.
And that's the top celestial is the dark blue.
Right.
Okay, very interesting. And
I guess one quick example of the celestial that is probably of interest is that when the Illuminati were formed and the formation of our United States government in 1776, or the onset of it, I should say, there was a particular meteor that was in orbit in a certain place in the sky, and that was the comet Temple. Okay, that is the very same comet that they crashed a NASA probe into on July 4th of last year. So from July 4th of 1776 to July 4th, 2005, that meteor was in the same position, and they chose that date of July 4th to crash a probe into it.
why do you think they did that?
Well, of course, there is the scientific value in doing that, but parallel with it, I'm sure that there is a mystical meaning corresponding to it, and that I would have to leave to other experts to speculate on.
That's research in the future.
Yes, that's future research. We need to get into actual conversation with people who are responsible for this.
Okay, what's next? What do we have next? Have you
Well,
covered this topic?
I think that what we can go into is start looking at things that happen on the surface that people can see as a reflection of this code, and realize how it is being employed, and then we'll go on to the aeronautical level and see how that ties in as well.
Okay.
Okay. If we move along here. I'm going to start off with a chapter that we'll call the Seal of Astaroth. Astaroth is a Sumerian god, as I say, dating prior to the Egyptian period, in which much of the black arts of the satanic movement that we see in practice today was born out of that period. And each of these gods during that period had a particular seal or emblem that signified that particular god. And I'm going to address the application of this seal to the architecture that they have employed on a grand scale.
Go.
Okay. All right, I'm going to pass by here and bring you to a satellite view of Washington, D.C. You're about 68,000 feet above the Capitol, and I've outlined in this rectangular area where the mall and the Capitol and those buildings are. If we take a look at that same area, there was a Mason of great significance by the name of L'Enfant, who designed the city plan for Washington, D.C. He had such a significance in terms of the honor bestowed on him on his death. He was the only civilian who was not military or political figure that was laid in state in the rotunda up until Rosa Parks this last year. Those are the only two people ever to lie in state in the rotunda who were not military or official. Okay, so his grand plan for the city plan included the famous driving circles. If you've ever driven through Washington, D.C., you know that it is a great challenge. And one of the challenges is getting around these various driving circles, the DuPont Circle, Scott Circle, Logan Circle, Washington Circle, and Mount Vernon. And just depicting where those circles are relative to the White House right there. Okay. If we bring those points together, we have a pentagram. And as you'll see as we move along here, we have much more than just a pentagram.
You want to explain a pentagram?
A pentagram is a symbol of one of the primary symbols that are used in the black arts of witchcraft. But also it is part of the mathematical tradition as well, in that Pythagoras was the first person to realize that if you have a certain kind of triangle and if you overlap three of them together, you get a pentagram. He was very much interested in the interface of mathematics and life, and trying to reflect a living pattern based on mathematics, and had a whole school of followers. So it has a mathematical tradition as well as a tradition in witchcraft.
And by the way, in the human sacrifices and the satanic culture noted for that, that's used in the ceremony itself.
This and other symbols as well.
Right.
More articulate symbols. If you consider the layout of that pentagram, and then consider three other landmarks in the Washington area. One being the Masonic Temple of the 33rd Degree Supreme Council, and that is considered to be the overall leadership of the Masonic organization throughout the world. And another major landmark is over in Alexandria, Virginia, which is the Masons Washington Memorial. And a third landmark, ironically, is the Vice Presidential Mansion. If we take a look at 16th Street, straight north of the White House, we have the 33rd Degree Temple. Now, this headquarters of the Masonry had essentially been a shoot of the history that was involved with the Revolutionary period, where the British Masonry influence in the United States became secondary because of the political conflict, and the French tradition was much more in favor and was much more employed in the Masonry here in the United States after the Revolutionary War. In the French tradition, the accent or influence of these Sumerian gods and goddesses is much more at the core of their ritual, and that's whenever you see a sign outside of a little town that says AF and AM, it means ancient, free, and accepted Masonry, where you see the little Mason sign at the edge of town. And
where would that be? In what countries?
Yeah, I mean, every little town in the United States. I mean, outside of every little town, you'll have a little Mason sign saying, you know, we meet here on such and such day and time. And as part of that sign, it will say AF and AM. And that means ancient, free, and accepted Masonry. And the important part of that is the ancient part, which is the ancient tradition that came out of that French influence, okay, and that involvement of these very early gods and goddesses in their ritual, okay. That 33rd degree temple is straight north of the White House, okay, and if you take a look at the vertices of these, right, and if you take a look at the vertices of these pentagram pattern, it bisects this vertice here, and of course is directly in line with the White House itself. Now, during this time period when Washington, D.C. was being constructed, there was competition between the French and the English and America for having the prime meridian right in their backyards. And the English, for whatever reason, have won out, and Greenwich is where the prime meridian resides. But in our attempt to be the founders of the prime meridian, or the holders or the host of the prime meridian, there is a marker just outside on the lawn of the White House indicating this is what they hope to be the zero meridian marker. Okay, and in fact, the hill up here is Meridian Hill. Okay. So there again, the interface between the subjective and the real is being played out. Another interesting point is that St. John's Church is adjacent to this line just north of the White House. St. John is very important in the Knights Templar and the Masons tradition. Okay, so that's no accident that St. John's Church happens to show up where it does. If we go down to Alexandria, Virginia, we see an aerial view here of the Masonic Washington Memorial. And you can see how the architecture, again, is very ornate and has specific significance mathematically and geometrically. It's no accident that they laid it out this way. It's not just that it's a pretty pattern. The relative position of that monument, the Masonic Washington Memorial in Alexandria, relative to the 33rd degree temple is illustrated here.
These are all satellite shots.
Yes, these are aerial.
And you put these together yourself?
Yes, I did. Yes. If you look at that same line, that orange line that runs down through to the George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria, it provides some additional guiding lines for additional points of interest. This point right here is where the signers of the Declaration of Independence Memorial is. If you take a look at this particular arrow here and points off to the Naval Observatory and the Vice Presidential Mansion. Looking at the line through here up to here intersects the 33rd degree temple. Okay, each of these construction lines gives you guidance in laying out this pattern. This pattern happens to be the seal of Astaroth. So they have trademarked our capital with the seal of a god. This is a god who allegedly cannot tell a lie when asked about the future. So their interest in Astaroth has to do with having a knowledge of and controlling the future. So a central role of the 33rd degree Masonry institution is about controlling future events. Okay. All right, so at this point I would like to transition to the second portion of this, These secret societies within the domain of the Masonry organization and others essentially are not only formulating the new government in the United States and at its inception, but they're expressing their dominant control across time ever since. And they do this architecturally. Jump to, once again, here's a location of the mall area in Washington, D.C. And once again, this is the overlay of the seal of Astaroth on the street pattern and the layout in Washington, D.C. And just to review where the 33rd degree temple is. Now, if we take a look at lines of dominance, I would call them, because they essentially assert that the 33rd degree temple, which is located right here, is in direct line with the intersection of these points of the pentagram to the Department of Defense, from the temple across this point to the Capitol, and of course straight down through this vertice to this point to the White House. And it's evident by having these projections going across from the 33rd degree temple to a point on the star that these are dominant levels of the government. Secondarily, if we follow projections from the 33rd degree temple across vertices like here, 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 and here, we come up with essentially going clockwise around it, the Department of Justice right here, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior, and the Department of State. And it's no accident that the choice of location for these institutions coincide with alignments between the 33rd degree temple and vertices on the pentagram. Pennsylvania Avenue has a unique aberration in that at the White House it goes to kind of a kilter. If you were to follow from the Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue, if you went on a straight line, you would run into buildings. They have offset the western portion of Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House at an angle that intercepts this corner of the pentagram. And there's a reason why they do that. That allows them to acknowledge that from this point to this point points to the Treasury, another very important portion of the government's activity. Going from point to point, across from here to here, brings you to the Department of Labor. So monetary control and control of production is essential core of what they regard as a government's responsibility and their responsibility to control. As afterthoughts, we have lines that go through a vertice here and here to the Supreme Court. Okay, from this vertice here to this one here, we're in line with the Federal Reserve. And it's evident that these institutions are tertiary in their concern in terms of control of society. Okay. Connecting the dots, all right. Between the 33rd degree Mason organization, there are other organizations that have allied themselves with it. And one of the organizations of most prominence and of most significance relative to recent events is the Skull and Bones organization. Skull and Bones is a Masonic-like organization that is based at Yale University, and seniors at Yale are invited in based on characteristics that they deem to be significant to be members of the club. There are only 15 each year, And a good accounting of the Skull and Bones organization, if you don't mind handing me that book, not that one, the other one there, is given in an account by Anthony Sutton. This is not a recent, he had, I forget, I think it was in the 1970s that he had written this particular, and it is as important today to understand how across time the Skull and Bones organization has controlled history since the 1880s up until the present time. And it's important to realize who are members of the Skull and Bones organization.
Go ahead, name him.
I'll give you three biggies. The three biggies are Dick Cheney, George Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker Bush, as well as George W. Bush. And another interesting sidelight is Kerry, our other presidential nominee this previous election cycle, was also a member of Skull and Bones. So Skull and Bones would have been in control no matter who won. And in fact, that is how they strategize. They are in control of both the Democratic and the Republican Party. There is a level of control that exists above those two parties. And the Democratic Party and the Republican parties are secondary players in a bigger picture.
Absolutely.
Okay. So if they have demonstrated this kind of architectural and mathematical relationship to institutions as we've demonstrated, what about this possible connection with Yale, between Yale University and the Skull and Bones organization, which on their campus is located right here? You may notice that, like in Washington, D.C., the campus is laid out with pentagram patterns and their walkways and their quadrangle areas. So it's no accident that there's a reflection of the same kind of pentagram detail on their campus as well as in Washington, D.C. And this precedes, the construction of this campus precedes Washington, D.C. Okay, and this is where the Skull and Bones building is located. It's also known as the Tomb. That's how they refer to their building.
Another secret society.
Yes, I mean probably the most powerful secret society.
The alums being
members of the Illuminati. This is the American faction of the Illuminati. Okay.
The Illuminati haven't been formed in 1776. May the 1st was when the 25 goals of the Illuminati were announced. The last of those 25 goals was to take over the world.
And they're on their way.
And they're well on their way.
And as it's coming up fast. We're marching towards that very quickly. If you take a look at back in Washington, D.C., the 33rd degree temple and this point on the pentagram pattern, and if you draw a line from here in both directions, you can create a circle that goes all the way around the Earth. Navigators regard this as what they call great circles. Both aeronautical and maritime navigators use great circle navigation to get to the shortest distance between 2 points on a spherical surface. So if you take a look at a line that goes along that construction of, I'm trying to find my point, there it is, from this point here to the 33rd degree temple, and follow it along. It marches up along the East Coast, goes through New York City, right over the head of the Statue of Liberty. Now this is a culmination of the French Masonic influence in placing the Statue of Liberty squarely under the Skull and Bones, what I will refer to as the Skull and Bones Great Circle. Because if you follow along here, it goes all the way around the world, but it also, I'm sorry, I need to back up. I should have backed up when I went forward. I'm sorry. Essentially, it goes through some very interesting areas like the Mideast and Nazareth and in Israel. It goes through, look at these locations. It goes through England, France, Switzerland, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, I can't pronounce it, Bosnia, where we've had recent years had activity. It goes straight through the Israeli-Palestine area, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and Yemen.
Herzegovina.
Yes, thank you for pronouncing that.
Herzegovina.
Yes, where we had the conflict in the 1990s. So it's no accident that we have these conflicts right on the Skull and Bones line, because it's part of the agenda. That line goes straight across the Yale campus right here. Okay? So that's where that line emanating from one point on the star and the 33rd degree temple in Washington, D.C. ends up crossing this pattern here at Yale campus relative to the Skull and Bones. Okay. All right, so this brings two organizations together in a very expressive, demonstrative way. It's no accident that Washington, D.C. and Yale campus have this geometry together, and that they are aligned along the Skull and Bones great circle, joining them together. They are married together in their activities. Okay, and that has been the case since its inception at the beginning of the founding of this nation. Okay, let me go on to our next one. They declare authorship of their actions, and they assign lines of responsibility both within organizations and on the surface of the earth. And I'll demonstrate that in a number of ways. Once again, just to review, this is where the layout of the 33rd degree temple relative to the White House is, and those relationships to those branches of government. Let's go back to the President Lincoln's assassination. I indicated that there are lines of responsibility that we think of, and within the hierarchy of organizations is most commonly when we think of that. But they also lay out these lines of responsibility on the ground. If you take a look at the 33rd degree temple, following through this vertice right here, on down to here, also from this point across this vertice to the same location, to that little red circle right there, that is Ford's Theater. That is where President Lincoln was assassinated. After providing two lines of attack on the president, they give you an honor line. This goes through the 33rd degree temple on through this vertice on down to the Lincoln Memorial. Now, if you see this just as in terms of one event, then you would think, well, maybe it's a fluke. Well, let's look on farther. Let's go on to McKinley. McKinley was shot at the train station. Here again, we get two lines of responsibility. From the 33rd degree temple, across this point of the star, to the train station. Here, across these two points of the star, to the train station. Okay, then they give a line of recognition or honor between this star point, this vertice, down to the McKinley Memorial, which sits just outside of the nation's Capitol building right here. As you go along the mall in either directions, right along that line emanating from the Capitol is the McKinley Memorial right there. So here in a second case, we have the very same configuration or utilization of lines of responsibility. Okay. Let's consider President Kennedy. When we take a look at the one line of attack from across point to point, that goes straight on to where his grave is. Okay. There's an honor line for President Kennedy in the sense of the Kennedy Center being across from the 33rd degree temple and this point to the Kennedy Center. So if there's only one line of responsibility, why is that? Of attack, I should say. Why is that relative to the other two? Well, one reason is because it was not done in town. And if you have the occasion of trying to get something done outside of town, it's always good to enlist a friend. If you take a look at where the Skull and Bones line goes around the Earth, as it goes through Yale campus here, its heading is at a 54-degree heading when you go north away from the Yale campus. If you follow this longitude or latitude of 41 degrees north where Yale resides and transmute that 54-degree heading value along this line to a 54-degree longitude value right here, that puts a point right out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But if you take that point right there, connect it to the 33rd degree temple, and follow it along, you come to Dealey Plaza in Texas. Not only do you come to Dealey Plaza in Texas, you come to Dealey Plaza at the point where Kennedy was shot. This is the line of attack coming from that point out in the Atlantic Ocean through the 33rd degree temple in Washington, D.C. to the very place where Kennedy was shot, down to the foot. Now that kind of mathematical precision is a signature. It is a modus operandi.
A little more than a coincidence.
Beyond any imaginable coincidence. It's not even possible to be a coincidence. Okay. Another interesting aspect about this, if you take a look at the Skull and Bones line or not the Skull and Bones line, but that line of attack to Dallas, and take a 90-degree angle turn from that attack line at the 33rd degree temple, it goes through this vertice here, it goes through Ford's Theater, and it comes to the FBI building. Amazing. Could this be a line of responsibility? I think so. All right. Maybe you can comment about the FBI.
Well, let's say there's a different FBI today than when I was in the FBI. I retired in March 1979. 21 years under J. Edgar Hoover. I don't care what you say about J. Edgar Hoover. He ran a great organization. We were known as the elite of all investigative agencies and all law enforcement agencies in the world, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover. And right after he died, it started, very frankly, it started declining.
And when was his death?
Well, there were some good directors along the way. Of course, we had L. Patrick Gray, not Rumsfeld, but Ruckelshaus.
Ruckelshaus, yes.
Was temporary.
Yes.
And then L. Patrick Gray, and then we had Clarence Kelly, and then we had not Louis Free, but Bill Webb. No, we had Bill Webster, and then we had Session, and then we had Free, and who do we have today?
Okay, we've gone on to Webster.
No, Webster.
I'm sorry.
The last one was who replaced Free?
I'm trying.
Ashcroft. Ashcroft
No,
was
he
Attorney
was
General.
Attorney General.
And
William
Mueller.
Webster. Mueller. That's
Mueller.
right, Mueller. That's
Mueller's
right.
our director today.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're both.
Well, yeah.
It's
Well,
late at night.
well, see, I've been out 26, 27 years, so
Yes, right.
we had quite a transition into the modern day era, and the FBI has changed considerably from the time that I retired. Not because of me, but
Well, it's been
because
through
those were
transition.
different times, and
Right.
and very frankly, it's not the organization it used to be.
Do you
I
think
have
that-
I have case after case that I presented to the FBI. I have an international child kidnapping case out of Washington D.C. known as the Finders,
Mhm.
which is a CIA covert operation. Ties into satanic cults, no question about it. It's been operating since the early 1960s, and I've formally filed complaints at least half a dozen times with the FBI and demanded an investigation. I've given that report to other so-called responsible authorities in Washington, D.C., demanded an investigation. I've been ignored. I had advanced information about 911. Actually, I didn't have it. One of my sources did. Gave it to the FBI on March the 20th, 2001. Ignored. The FBI was involved in the car bombing February 26, 1993 of the World Trade Center. According to the New York Times article, October 28, 1993, the FBI had an informant in among the terrorists. He was ordered by the terrorists to put the bomb together. He went to his superiors and the FBI, his handlers. We're going to use a dummy bomb. No, the FBI supervisor said, no, we're going to use a real bomb. So the FBI not only knew in advance, they furnished ingredients for the bomb.
And the direction.
And the direction, that's right. So the FBI has been corrupted.
Yes.
And because of my outspoken position with the FBI, I have been kicked out of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI. I've been expelled, and I'm not concerned about that at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of as a little joke, I recently called and told them I wanted to be reinstated, and never received a response back.
Well, I think it's going to have to go through a transition before
I
we
think
expect a
we'll have to
response.
bring Jan Hoover back, I think.
Would you expect that there may be a small circle of covert FBI agents who may have been involved with these kinds of operations?
There's absolutely no question about it.
Back at the Kennedy period.
I have knowledge of a covert operation by the FBI involving 5 different agents from different FBI field divisions who were called in. They're not involved on their day-to-day work with each other. They're called in for assignments, and off they go. And I don't know the details of their assignments, but I know one of them was involved in drugs. This particular FBI agent was assigned to Omaha, and he operated out of Offutt Air Force Base. It's a SAC base, as you know, right outside Omaha, and which is known as a CIA operation. There's a lot of CIA activity within Offutt Air Force Base. So I have this knowledge. I know that within our government there are 2 elements. There's the covert and the overt. The overt operation are the fellows in the suits and the ties that show up at the bank robbery, and what did he look like, and how tall, and what did he weigh. The covert operation involves assassinations, burglary, murder, kidnappings, and they're regular criminals. And they're recruited out of special forces, including McVeigh, who was recruited out of special forces, by the way, on Oklahoma City. And these people answer to no one. There's no paper trail, and they use these men and women for covert surveillances, illegal activity, criminal activity, and you're looking at one of the victims, by the way, I might mention. I have absolute documentation that I have in my system as we sit here and look at the camera, and I'm looking at you and the camera. I have absolute documentation from a laboratory that I have 3 times the safe level of arsenic in my system. And it has been administered to me through aerosol. I have needle marks in my car between the door and the door jamb where they put poison into my car when it's locked and the windows are all up. And I breathe this and it goes into my system. I have this it's well documented. So this is a covert operation of the government. I think that in particular this is probably NSA, military intelligence, working together.
One of the interesting things that you made an observation of is no paper trail. The Masonry organization is so secretive about even their rituals that they leave no paper trail about their internal operations or their rituals. Everything is word of mouth, so it is a very few trusted individuals that actually get into the very inner circle and retain this oral communication.
Bob, I interviewed Jip Tatum, 25-year Black Ops operator with the CIA, and he told me that he could go into a bank in, I think it was Rochester, New York, and on his signature obtain $250,000 cash for some of his covert operations, and he'd use that to pay off his buddies with no paper trail. So we have this. Now we have, most recently, President Bush has announced that we have secret wiretaps, right, without going through the courts. The Foreign Intelligence Act of 1978, which was signed by Jimmy Carter, as I recall, allowed for us to wiretap secretly through the courts certain individuals who were suspected of being involved in terrorist activities.
Right.
This latest move does not go through the courts whatsoever, and the President and Gonzales, our Attorney General today, are standing up and defending it, saying it's all right because we're just doing it against the bad terrorists who are in communication overseas only. Do you believe that? You believe that? And I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, and I'll tell you right now, I'm a New York City garbage man if you believe that. That is absolute unbelievable that the President of the United States would be involved in a criminal act like this. You and I do some illegal wiretapping without going through anybody. What do you think is going to happen to us? We go to jail for 20, 30, 40 years. So this whole thing, it's a scam, and it's a sham, and it's a march forward rapidly by the New World Order, the globalists, whatever you want to call them, toward taking over the world, and that's what we're talking about here.
That's right. And one of the biggest absence of a paper trail is on September 10th when Donald Rumsfeld announced that they lost track of over $1 trillion.
That was September 10th of 2001.
Right, the day before the 9/11.
The day before now, and then because of 9/11, of course, everybody forgot about that one.
That's right. So the paper trail that got lost then, it has remained lost today.
I wonder where that went. Do you think it might have gone to Switzerland?
Oh, man, a number of interesting places like that.
Right.
Yes.
I think that one of this line goes through Switzerland that we're talking about, doesn't it? We're going to discuss that tomorrow?
We can discuss that later, but it does go straight through Zurich. Yes. It's right at the core of it. And of course, the Knights Templar are the founders of our banking system that we know today, and that was developed in the medieval and period during their tenure of control over the European political scene. So this is something that hasn't changed, okay, in all this time. So
we have some more here, I believe, don't we?
yes, we do.
Yes, okay, let's go.
We're only started. This is only the beginning.
We're just getting warmed up.
We're just getting warmed up. Okay. All right, so if we want to take a look at Martin Luther King's assassination, we don't have to go very far because they used the same line. They didn't have to draw a new line for after the Kennedy assassination, because the line that they had created for the assassination of President Kennedy goes through Memphis. They didn't have to do any work. You know, just repeat the same page.
They had to wait till he went to Memphis to do it, though.
They got him there, and they did it.
Yeah, they waited till he went there to do it, though.
Just like they got Kennedy to Dallas to do it.
That's right.
Okay, I think that Johnson probably had a hand in that. In any case,
I know that Johnson had a hand in that.
Yeah. In any case, if you take a look at the fact that that attack line goes straight through Memphis, where Martin Luther King was assassinated. Once again, we have to have an honor line, and we create that honor line for Martin Luther King by going at Washington, D.C., we go from this vertice through this vertice to the Martin Luther King Library, right along that line, along the same line that goes to the Supreme Court. So there may be some figurative relationship there. It's hard to actually understand, but it's the same line. Let's come to September 11th, 2001. What happened on the surface of the Earth that was a reflection of their plan? Well, that plan, or that geometry, had been sitting there all along, all throughout time. Again, if you take a look at where the Skull and Bones Great Circle line goes through this vertice and the 33rd degree temple onto Skull and Bones in Yale, and you draw a 90-degree angle from the Skull and Bones line through this vertice, you come to the FBI building. From a 90-degree departure from the Skull and Bones line through this vertice brings you to the Department of Justice. The most interesting line of responsibility of all is a line, it's maybe hard to see, but it's a green line that starts at this vertice, goes through this vertice, and ends up at this point right here, which is the FAA. So the FAA had a significant hand in the development of events on 9/11. So when they planned to put the FAA building in this place, I believe in the 1960s probably is when they constructed it, there was no accident that they put it along this line. They had intentions of using that line of responsibility decades ago. Let's take a look at the Pentagon. An aerial view again, and down here I've outlined in black the Pentagon building because it's a little bit faint against the background. If you take a look at a line running through these two vertices on down, as well as from the 33rd degree temple, I'm sorry, along this vertice, and that's not 33rd degree temple, that's just a vertice of the pentagram through this vertex point of the pentagram. It also passes by the Pentagon. Now, on closer inspection, one of those lines misses the building by several feet right here. But the other line, interestingly, goes through this north wall and this wall adjacent to it in a straight line. And the trajectory through which the allegedly Flight 77 attack came along this line is exactly at the outer wall intersection of this particular trajectory from the pentagram.
And I think it's interesting to note that the opening was 16 feet across.
It's a little bit small.
A little bit small for an airplane of that size, I believe.
For a 757, yes.
757.
Yes. And in any case, but the precision to come across from a line of direction from the pentagram and have it intercept the very location on the wall that where the impact occurred indicates a degree of precision that no human pilot could possibly have accomplished, number one, and to, of all sides of the building to exactly hit the intercept of that line at the wall is no accident. That was a plan, and it was not the pilot on board who accomplished that.
I believe all the generals and the higher-ups were on the other side of the building that day,
They
weren't
were very safe that day, yes.
Right.
And we didn't lose anybody above the rank of probably
Clerks.
captain, clerk or captain, right. Mostly that side was vacated, and the planning for the construction to vacate that part of the building was planned as part of the whole overall operation. Just as there was a relative few people on board those flights compared to all other flights who were transatlantic flights that day, or transcontinental flights that day. just to give you an indication of where the Skull and Bones line relative to the World Trade Center, this is the footprint of where it once was right here, and you see here how closely the Skull and Bones line comes past there. We'll have a little more detail about that later. Now you see here is again the employment of the Pythagorean pentagram geometry. If you have a triangle that has a 36-degree angle on two sides and 108, and then take 3 of those and overlap them, you have a pentagram. If you take that triangle and lay it along the along the Skull and Bones line, you have the flight path of flight. Okay. Once again, just as a preface, this is that coating shell. And this is the application of the Skull and Bones itinerary to the aeronautical shell. And we'll go into a little bit of a preface and then how, when, who, and where. In this preface, we have the Federal Aviation Administration offices that are responsible for the Federal Aviation Airway System. In particular, there is an Office of Aviation System Standards and the National Aeronautical Charting Office. Together with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, these are the 2 primary parties responsible for the development of all aeronautical charts that are employed by pilots, and also the placement and the operation of the navigational aids that are along the various airways. Okay. I'm trying to recall where that. Can you hand me that map there? It's sitting underneath there, right there. Thank you. Every FAA chart has a declaration, and right here it's in fine print, and you can't possibly see it on camera, but I've got it right here. And it says it's published in accordance with Interagency Air Cartographic Committee specifications and agreements approved by the DoD and the FAA, which means nothing gets on an FAA map used by a pilot that isn't approved of by the Department of Defense. These 2 are married together at the hip and have always been the case. Now, they had in its prior iteration, the charting responsibilities were part of the Air Force's Office of Aeronautical Charting and Information Center, which was in St. Louis, incidentally. And that became taken over in recent times by this geospatial organization, which is much more tied to DoD operations and intelligence operations. So now there's an intimate link between the intelligence agencies and the civil aviation activities. This here is what's called an IFR, en route high altitude chart, and this is a depiction of where that chart covers in the United States. It's essentially the eastern United States, and this chart is used strictly for operations that are above 18,000 feet. So primarily this is your jet and commercial airway operations. Okay. All right. And these charts are offered in a very interesting listing. If you go to the FAA's website, you will see offerings for all these technical charts for all around the world in various manners and forms, and every one of these are strictly aviation technical charts. Okay, let's get to page 2. We go down through the list. Again, everything on this list is technical until you get to the end, and it says historical maps. And under historical maps, they also have a little section that says posters, aeronautical posters, $4. But they don't list anything about what aeronautical posters they offer. They just make the declaration, if you send in $4, you'll get some sort of grab bag, I guess, of a poster. But it's very incidental to the fact that what they do very prominently offer is a map to Washington, D.C., which is the L'Enfant plan of the Washington, D.C., which we covered in the first sections, which was the seal of Astaroth. Okay? Now,
This says 1792.
yes. So why would the Federal Aviation Administration make an offering for the city plan of Washington, D.C. from 1792 as part of its technical offering? Why? Because you're hanging out a shingle. It says, if you're one of us, you'll recognize why we list this here, so drop by and say hi, okay? This is analogous to the placards that Masons post at the edge of small towns. If you remember, come on by, we're open for business. So there is a core of operation with the FAA that is controlled by the Skull and Bones organization and the 33rd degree Masonry, and this is their declaration of it. That may seem very incidental, but as we go on, you'll find that that is very compelling. Here's another compelling thing. Up until November 18th in 2004, there's no concern about offering aeronautical charts to the public. Anyone could purchase a chart like this and other similar charts that pertain to various aviation operations. But then they made the announcement, effective October 2005, we are no longer offering these what they call flip charts, or flight information publications, to the public. After this date, they're proposing that we have to go through an authorized dealer who will check you out and only make the sale of these charts to appointed people.
Like pilots?
Pilots, but that had been not a concern for 50 years. They have charts out there that they've been putting out all this time. Why all of a sudden, in recent months, are they shutting down the availabilities to the general public?
Do you have an answer for that?
Yes.
I thought you did.
And you'll see it in just a moment. First off, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how the National Aviation Airway System is organized. They use a station called a VOR, a very high frequency omnidirectional range station. I've got a depiction of one here sitting on a hill. And they have different flavors depending on whether it's strictly civil, or this is the military version, the Tactical Aeronautical Navigation Station, or a merging of the two operations in a VORTAC, or a VOR that has additional distance measuring equipment attached to it. Each of these are depicted on aviation charts in such a way that they become waypoints along the way to what is essentially highways in the sky. And if you can just get an idea here, looking here, you can see these rows, compass rows here at the center. These are VOR stations, and the lines between them are jet routes, which are essentially highways in the sky. All right, and because of the camera not being able to pick up detail on there, I will transpose some of the information off of this chart onto the screen. Okay. All right. How does a VOR work? A pilot will have an indicator on his dash that he'll dial in a particular line that he wants to fly. If he wants to fly 270-degree direction away from the station, then if he does that, and he's on this side of the station, on the eastern side of the station, before he gets to the station, on this side it'll indicate to the station. As he passes by the station, it'll indicate from the station, and vice versa. So these stations provide directional information, not just telling which direction to the station, but it tells the pilot where they are relative on a compass direction from the station. And it doesn't have anything to do with the direction their nose is pointed. It only has a indication of where their position is in the sky. Okay, how do we employ the skull and bones itinerary within the aeronautical shell? Well, we take and we connect specific means of performing the attack with navigational aids that are adjacent to the attack sites. All right, how? Matching the attacking aircraft to navigational radio stations adjacent to the respective targets. Okay, I have a listing here of the 4 flights involved in 9/11 that we're aware of. If we take a look at American Airlines Flight 11, there are 3 kinds of identification you can find for an aircraft, one being the number that you would find on the tail of the aircraft indicating its FAA registration. It's just like a license plate. Of course, there's the aircraft model of American Airlines 11. Flight 11 was a 767-223, and then the serial number of production number that Boeing assigned to that aircraft. Flight American Airlines 11 was serial number 22332, and this prefix of 223 has nothing to do with, it is not a compulsory thing that you begin a series 223 aircraft with a serial number 223. For instance, 757-223, the American Airlines Flight 77, begins its digital serial number with 246. This one has nothing to do with this serial number sequence, or this with that. Okay, but it is interesting that this number and the first 3 digits here are the same digital sequence. Now, if we take a look at this map here in detail, what we would find is one of the jet routes that emanates from, find my pointer here, from the LaGuardia VOR on the map, projects away from the station at a 322-degree direction, which incidentally is the code value for skull and bones. If you take a look at, I'll find it here quickly here. Well, this is not a very good depiction of it, but I'll show it to you quickly. It has the skull and bones, and 322 is their organizational designation. Okay. What has happened throughout time is that they have used 322 as an indication of a heading, okay, as they have here. Notice that along jet route number 223, this one here, that's jet route 223, coming from LaGuardia VOR, is where we find American Airlines serial number 223 on jet route 223, emanating from a radial direction of 322 degrees, which is the skull and bones designation. This is the distance to a particular reporting point that pilots use, or they call it a fix. In this case, it's a DMA fix. It's a distance from the station where when a pilot gets to that point, he would report to an air traffic controller his position and intentions to either turn or proceed or follow the flight plan. This little label here indicates the number of nautical miles from that VOR station to that reporting point called chords. Each of these reporting points have a name. So when a pilot flies over, he indicates to the air traffic controller that he has passed chords. 74 happens to be the exact longitude of the World Trade Center. Okay. LaGuardia VOR is the VOR station closest to the World Trade Center. Okay. When we take a look at, in Washington, D.C., at the VOR on the Reagan International Field adjacent to the Pentagon, within just a mile or two of the Pentagon, this particular VOR has a projection out to a DME fix called Pauke out here, and it is along the line of 246 degrees. Incidentally, this pointer from this label is exactly aligned with that 246 degree direction on the map and this designation on the map. Now, it is a kind of amazing coincidence that the first 3 digits of the serial number, 246, for American Airlines Flight 77 matches this very same configuration, as did the 223 match the serial number in this configuration here at the very navigational aid that is most adjacent to the attack site. And these are the lead aircraft in both occurrences.
So, are you saying then that these planes were handpicked before because of their numbers?
Yes. Yes.
And this ties into what you said earlier during this interview, secret information that is actually out there into the public, but the public doesn't realize that it's
well, there is
its significance or its meaning.
There are people in the public that are in the know, but they're a very, very small circle of people who are in the know. It is interesting to note that American Airlines, because of its financial condition, was in receivership, I believe, and the 2 aircraft that they own that were involved with this were not owned by American Airlines. They were owned by banks out of Wilmington, Delaware. Namely, First Union National Bank owned Flight A11, and American Airlines Flight 77 was owned by Wilmington Trust. And those aircraft were not in the lineup for those flights on those days. They were transposed in that position at the last minute. They were not
scheduled.
The flight
those flights were not scheduled with those airplanes. Is that what you're saying?
on that day.
On that day.
Until the last minute.
Well, how did the banks have to do with that? The Wilmington Trust and so forth.
That's an interesting question, and would seriously consider as an investigation.
You have any thoughts on that?
It would only be speculative at this point, but I'm sure that there is infiltration of this Skull and Bones organization and within the financial structure of our country. Their utilization of these aircraft is no accident. Ownership of these by parties who may be involved with the Skull and Bones organization is probably not a happenstance. Certainly the trading activity for American Airlines and United Airlines a few days prior to the attack were indications that there were people in the banking institutions who knew this was going to happen, and trading on put options on these aircraft or these airlines
was at an all-time high.
Yes.
I think I saw a figure once where it was like 9 times high above the normal.
I'm aware of that, but I know that it was out of the normal range.
Yes, on I think not only American but also United.
Both.
Both.
Yes.
So there were people that had to know about this in advance.
That's right. And then certainly there are people who are much more knowledgeable about that aspect of it than I am.
Well, now, would the fact that that these two airplanes, by American Airlines airplanes, were owned by a bank and not by American Airlines be significant? Because each airplane, I understand, if you incorporate each airline singly rather than incorporate them as part of a large corporation with, say, 50 airplanes, if that plane goes down, the company doesn't go bankrupt. They just can sue for that one plane.
That is a financial technical question you'd have to address another expert. I'm not able to address that.
But could that be the reason that they're with the bank? These airplanes are with the two different banks?
It's interesting that they both have the same address on Rodney Square in Wilmington, Delaware, in the same building.
Speculation again if we do anything beyond that.
Obviously, a small group of people within those two banks were in the know.
We're in the know, right.
Okay. And the choice of those aircraft were under their supervision. Okay. Let's jump to LaGuardia Airport and the LaGuardia VOR that I mentioned just in that previous slide. Once again, just bounce back to the previous slide. This is the LaGuardia VOR, which is adjacent to the World Trade Center. If you take a close-up view of it, remember, it looks like a hat kind of structure. LaGuardia VOR is placed out on pilings out over water, and at the end of runway 22 at LaGuardia Airport is actually built out over the water. So this actually looks sort of like an aircraft carrier deck when you look down on it. And you've got this VOR station very peculiarly placed out in the water. This is not the usual kind of placement of a VOR station. I have indicated here that there are two different directions that aviation operations correspond to. The true north that goes straight to the North Pole, as well as the magnetic north, which the compass settings are aligned to. Runways are designated based on their magnetic heading by the first two digits. For instance, runway 22 is roughly aligned along a line of 220 degrees. Interestingly, if you measure along the magnetic heading of this runway, that magnetic heading is 223 degrees. Okay, so we have, again, the reoccurrence of the value 223 and the serial number of the aircraft, the jet airway assigned to the navigational aid of this very navigational station, and as well as the model number of the 767 that was used in that particular attack, and that first attack in the World Trade Center. All right. Let's just focus on that one attack and go through that to give you an idea of how this all strings together, starting at the Statue of Liberty and LaGuardia VOR. If you recall, the Skull and Bones line runs directly over the head of the Statue of Liberty, and these are the heading in the northern and southern direction from that point. Here is the LaGuardia VOR relative to where the location of the Statue of Liberty is in the greater New York area. Okay, this is the exact placement of latitude and longitude of this particular LaGuardia VOR station adjacent to the runway. And to give you an idea of the precision of this, when you take a look at a measurement on the Earth's surface of degrees, minutes, and seconds, 1 second on the Earth's surface is about 100 feet long. So when you come down to a positioning of 1.4, you are coming down to a precision of in the tens of feet of accuracy. So and this is an FAA published value on the map. So and with the FAA's listed information for this particular navigational aid. So I'm using the FAA's own information. The VOR stations are primarily used for en route or from cross-country, from airport to airport or station to station in their utility. They can be used for approaches to landings, and the VOR method of instrument guidance to a landing is the least accurate of those that are offered. The instrument landing system with a localizer and glide slope is standard with a higher degree of precision, and now they're coming into use of microwave landing systems that are very accurate. But they, in some applications, especially in smaller airports and in remote areas, VOR approaches to landing can be employed. But if you wanted to utilize this as even for an instrument approach to this runway, I have shaded in the area along which you could have placed this VOR station, including jumping across the bay to a location a mile or two to the north, and place that very same station and had the same degree of precision and utility, but yet they have chosen to put it right out here in the water. Okay, so we have very peculiar placement based on its utility. Okay, one of the things that are offered by the FAA to pilots is what is called NOTAMs, or Notice to Airmens. NOTAMs are required for the pilot to review prior to flight planning to understand that if there has been any changes in navigational station operations, they are to be responsible for knowing that before departure. And so Notice to Airmens, or NOTAMs, are standard FAA literature, and they're reviewed and updated very frequently. It is interesting to note that most VOR stations do have some limitations based on obstructions in the area, and it's not unusual for a VOR station to have a limitation in its use on 2 or 3 or 4 directions from the station. But the LaGuardia VOR has 32 specific indications where it is not to be used or relied upon for any kind of reasonable precision, and it is so bad in its placement that it has 32 qualifications for not using the station. Each one of these that I have listed here are separate listings of specific points along the radius of the station where it is not to be used.
Why?
Because the signal is being interfered with by some obstruction, and the pilot will be getting erroneous information.
Why are they doing that?
Well, why did they place it here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously they didn't consider optimal performance in their selection, and when they go through the planning process, they know they're going to encounter this kind of problem before they construct it, based on their understanding of the line of sight of radio waves and the actual surrounding conditions. So they have chosen the absolute worst possible location of this in terms of its performance. But yet, in the 1950s, when they placed this is where they chose to place it. So
why?
There's other reasons why.
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
We'll see.
You going to show us?
Yes.
By the way, going back to the map that's no longer available, why is that map no longer available? You have some thoughts on that?
Because it has information that they don't want us to realize.
What kind of information?
Indications that plannings of attacks are actually specified on the maps.
In the future?
In the past.
In the past? Okay.
And in the future, probably.
Okay.
Obviously, with the indications of the matching of the serial numbers with specific radio navigational aids adjacent to attack sites was past information that they had published on their maps. Okay,
And they don't want anybody like you figuring it out in the future.
Well, are figuring it out in the past.
Or figure out. Too late for that. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, let's jump to when. Okay, when are we going to attack? If we take
When are we going to attack?
Or when are they going to?
They're
I'm
going
sorry,
to
I was
attack, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Watch your language there.
Yes, so I'm going to have to.
You've been doing very well. I'm imagining you're pretty tired by now, aren't
Okay,
you?
well, I'm okay. If we take a step backwards and look at the location of LaGuardia VOR adjacent to the runway, and this is where the Skull and Bones line runs, adjacent to it. It's not exactly on it, but it's adjacent to it. This line that I have here, the white line, projects away from the Statue of Liberty. They both intersect the Statue of Liberty back down the road. Okay. Now, when we take a look at the point at which this line, this white line, and this yellow line, the Skull and Bones line, are equidistant from the Statue of Liberty, and we draw a line from the center of the station across to that intersection of equal distance on the Skull and Bones line, we develop this vector, or this arrow here, that goes off in a direction of 320.95 degrees. And that will become very important later on to pay attention to. But the other interesting thing is that the distance between these two lines happens to coincide with one of those magical coding values, namely base E. If you take base E and divide it by 10, you have the number of mileage distance between these two lines right here. Furthermore, when comparing this gap of 1,434 feet, that is very close to another magical coding value, and that being 1,436. It turns out that in a day, when the Earth goes through one revolution, or 360 degrees, it's not quite a noon to noon day. The Earth actually has to turn 320 plus a little bit more each day to come from noon to noon. And that's because we're advancing in the orbit and it has to compensate. So for the Earth to make a 360 degree turn, that's called a sidereal day, not a standard day, a sidereal day. And that particular day is 1,436 minutes long. Okay? That gap is very close to a sidereal day in minutes. A standard day is 1,440 minutes from noon to noon. So this 4-minute difference is something that we have a little bit of a gap that occurs every day. All right. So we've matched two coding values from their mathematical coding structure to that particular vector. All right. Now, if we take a look at LaGuardia VOR, it has a frequency that it is specifying. All right. To tune in to this particular radio, you would tune into 113.1 megahertz. Well, this is very interesting that it's 113.1, because if you take the day of the African bombings in Kenya and Tanzania to the day of the attacks on 9/11 is 1,131 days. So if you take this frequency value and multiply it by 10, you have the number of days between the African embassy bombings to the morning of the 9/11 attacks. So the choice of frequency, which was designated 50 years ago when they put in this VOR, was placed and utilized during the planning for the attack. All right. Now, when you consider that the distance, let me back up to two previous slides. Forgive me for this equidistant length along here back to the Statue of Liberty, and from this point, which is equidistant back to the Statue of Liberty, is exactly 11.312127 miles. Okay? That happens to be down to the second, expressed as, if you take this value and express it in terms of days, you would have exactly the number of days expressed in a decimal expression down to the second from the 2:40 a.m. time when the African bombings attacks, that's Eastern Standard Time, happened in 1998, to the impact of Flight 11 on the North Tower to the second. Okay, that kind of precision to accomplish could not have been accomplished by
accident
and by pilots who were so poorly competent, okay, as were the case with allegedly
if there were pilots there.
Yes. Okay. So, taking things in terms of distances, frequencies, and transposing them into times is a way of recognizing how they're using the code. All right. We have who is involved. We have signatures that they have, just like leaving fingerprints at the scene of the crime. These people left the fingerprints before they actually committed the crime. We have the Masons and the Skull and Bones have left their signature. A big one is by George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush president, and L. Cieta, and we'll go into detail on each case. Let's first look at the combined signature of the Masons and Skull and Bones. If you look at the New York City area and you take and draw a 90-degree angle relative to the Skull and Bones line along an angle of 322 degrees, which again is the coding value for Skull and Bones, you have a intercept at St. Mary's Park and St. John's University. Okay, both of these are very evident in Knights Templar and Masonic ritual, and those, at least we know that the St. John's College was placed at this location in 1870. So the planning for locations for this overall geometry in the greater New York City area is been evident ever since their imprint on this over a long period of time. We have also that same 322-degree angle runs right through the VOR station in question. Okay, and then we have much more to do here, and I'm wondering if we should take a break. This may be a good time to take a break, and we'll go into the signature for George Herbert Walker Bush. Okay?
And continue this tomorrow. I mean, let's finish this up, and then continue on that same tape for tomorrow.
Right. Okay.
Part 2. And my butt is sore.
Okay.
You must be wiggling around?
Yeah, I've been wiggling around too.
We're back. Ted Gunderson here. February the 9th, 2006. Continuation of my interview with Bob Fisher. Bob, we're back on camera.
All right.
And thanks for a great presentation the first 2 hours.
Well, it's starting to scratch the surface, I hope.
Well, we're into another interesting topic here, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah, we began, or left off at the tail end of our discussion with people who leave their signatures at the scene of the crime. And now we'll go ahead and look at his signature that he planted there well in advance.
Which crime is this now?
9/11.
9/11, okay.
All right, so recalling that the number 223 seems to be a very important factor in the 9/11 planning. If we take a step back up into space and look at things on a bigger view and go up here into Maine, this is where the location of Kennebunkport, Maine is, and we have a famous president who resides there, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Ex-president.
Ex-president. And he happens to have a VOR in his neighborhood, the Kennebunk VOR-TAC, which it means it's a combination of the civilian and the military combined. And the station is just adjacent to where he lives.
Just a minute. We talked about VORs earlier, of course, in the last interview. Explain to the layman what VOR is.
Okay. VORs are a way in which aviation systems set up to provide pilots with directional navigation in a way that they know where they are along a line of sight from a given station according to a compass direction. And these are stationed or placed all around the United States and provide waypoints for highways in the sky.
And you mentioned in the other interview about when they go from one area to another. That's what you were talking about, right?
Right.
Okay.
And here
it's like do they radio down to the operator, or is it something automatic?
it's automatic. These are transmitters, and the pilot has a receiver in the cockpit that picks up the signal, which is a differential signal according to where they are in a compass direction from the station, so that they can determine where they are.
So it's like a road map.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. As you recall in earlier segments that we were encountering the number 223 and the serial numbers of American Airlines Flight 11, the particular jet air route that emanates from LaGuardia VOR, that being jet route 223 here. And when we take a look at the relationship of Kennebunk VOR-TAC and George Herbert Walker Bush's backyard, it happens to be along a 223-degree heading to the LaGuardia VOR. Okay, now the chances of this are being just a happenstance is an impossibility. Okay, this is totally impossible for it to be a random chance. Furthermore, when you take a look at another landmark that we discussed earlier, that DME fixed chords, where the pilots will call in and indicate the flight controllers that they've passed this particular waypoint as a way of managing traffic control. We can take a look at a related line, or a point along this line, with a certain degree of interest. You recall that when we were looking at the distance along the line from the Statue of Liberty to the VOR station, and from the Statue of Liberty along the Skull and Bones line, at a certain point you're at the exact distance that corresponds to the exact time and days of the event, the time from the African bombings of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania up into the first impact of Flight 11 into the North Tower. Namely, they're at this particular point along both those lines, they're equidistant at 11.312 miles. That happens to be, if you transpose this decimal point to 1131.2128, that is the number of days down to the second at which you have that time span between the African bombings and Flight 11's impact in the first tower, so down to an exact second. Here is that line coming down from Kennebunk VOR-TAC down to the LaGuardia station. And recall I mentioned earlier that there would be some significant interest in this 320.9 degree line where we have a point coming from the VOR station to that equidistant point on the Skull and Bones line. Well, the interest is this. If we follow that same line at 320.9 degrees out to where it intersects with that line that runs from Kennebunk down towards the Chords DME fix that we mentioned earlier, there is a location along this line near to Monticello, New York, which is equidistant along both of these lines. In other words, we've got two sets of equidistant lengths determined by the same line. This 320 degree, 0.9 degree line is the only place along an equidistant point from the Kennebunk vortex. If you notice that this arc is an equidistant length from the vortex. Now, this 320.9 degree line intersects exactly along the arc where both of these vectors intersect in an equidistant arc. And once again, when we take a look down at the Statue of Liberty, the Skull and Bones line and the line to the vortex are both terminated at the very same line. So we have two circumstances where we have defined equidistances from an attack source and from the source of the author as equidistant lines, okay, determined by one line, okay. So there again we have a mathematical relationship that is pretty hard and fast and not too randomly possible. So we have a whole series of relationships of these quaint relationships between the Kennebunk vortex and the jet route 223 and the airliner that has the serial number 223 and so on. And as we take a look at the reoccurrence of these various things, for all these things to come together is an impossibility to not have a design behind it. And the people who are involved with this essentially are providing two important concepts to be reckoned with. Okay, first, there exists a signature reflecting their strategic modus operandi over a long period of time. The global surface shell and the aeronautical shell, there is an architectural design evident that they've imposed, just as the Seal of Astaroth in Washington, D.C. was very meticulously arranged. These arrangements of the VOR stations in our aeronautical aviation system are very strategically arranged to correspond to these geometries that I have indicated. Furthermore, these geometric configurations pertain to the attack on 9/11. So when you consider the fact that the placement of these VORs, these heading relationships, and the frequencies that are assigned to stations date back to the 1950s, there has been a very long-range plan at work here. So on a strategic level, they have left their signature over a long period of time, which indicates that there are various offices within the FAA and the Department of Defense that have been working together to assure that this Skull and Bones, how should I say, itinerary has been firmly built up over time. So we have a body of people who have had the responsibility to assure that this configuration would remain within the Federal Aviation Administration's purview and under their control over a long period of time. Furthermore, there exists a signature of the tactical level in the months leading up to the attack, indicating that they're taking specific aircraft with specific serial numbers and corresponding them to specific navigational aids in the Federal Aviation Airway System. That kind of tactical arrangement is evidence to the depth at which they are going to arrange these attacks and mark them with their signature. Okay.
It'd be interesting to learn when the Bush family bought the Kennecott property, wouldn't it?
It'd be interesting to know who made the decision to put the VOR in their backyard. And
when, not only that, but maybe he bought it, say, on February the 22nd of some year.
So yeah, it could be. If we look back, there could be some interesting little quaint relationship in terms of that.
Yeah, they probably put the VOR in there after he bought it, don't you think?
Yes, I'm sure that the family property was there well in advance of the VOR. But the assignment of the VOR to that location
it had to be approved by the FAA.
It had to be approved by not just the FAA, the DOD. And
Department of Defense.
Right, because they work together hand in hand. Nothing happens in the FAA without the DOD's blessing. So there are people in offices throughout this period of time who have been in charge of the charting and the placement of navigational aids, the assignment of frequencies to these navigational aids that were later used in the attacks on 9/11. And that planning has been taking place for a very long time.
You say since at least the early 1950s.
Then when the VOR started to be placed into the system, yes. Yes. So if we take a look at another cast of characters, we were told that Al-Qaeda was the culprit involved, but in fact, as others have indicated, there's Al-Qaeda that has actually been involved, because the people who are involved with the Muslim aspect of this perspective have been under the purview of the CIA. And a recognition and a signature of that can be noticed once again by revisiting the passage of the Skull and Bones line past that runway where LaGuardia VOR is. Just across this little water gap where the Skull and Bones line runs through, along a 322-degree angle, you run right over the Rikers Island high security penitentiary, where we have, among other people, the Blind Sheikh, who was responsible for the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. Having residence here is not just a matter of incarceration and penal consideration. It is also a consideration of a signature for a future attack. Okay, on February 26, 1993, there was an attack on day 892.4, blah, 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 in that respective 1440-day cycle. They are operating in 1440-day cycles. It happened that the 9/11 attack happened on the 1131st day of that respective cycle. A previous cycle was involved with the earlier attack in 1993, and it occurred on the 892nd day of that particular cycle. Okay, this left a residual from 1440 of 547.5987 days in that cycle. Once again, we match that very closely to one of the magic coding values that are used in the coding structure, and having the digital sequence 547.3561, and the significance of that in terms of its background can be introduced later, but the matching here is a very close precision, 0.0443% variation from it. And if you take that and consider that there are 1,440 minutes in a day, and you were to look at a 24-hour clock face and to transform that value of 547 out of the 1,440 swing of the arc, that would bring you to 223 degrees on the dial. Okay, once again, a reaffirmation of the involvement of 223 in the overall scope. Okay.
Do you have any idea why it's 223?
That I am not certain
As far
of.
as the secret
It-
message,
I think
subliminal
it's-
message is concerned?
I think it's probably a PIN number. It's sort of like, you know, we go and plug a PIN number in to get into the ATM machine, and the PIN number for this attack is 223.
Gotcha.
Okay, that's my best evaluation of that at this point. There are probably better evaluations if we uncover more information.
So if we got one of those old maps that they don't make available to the public anymore and start looking for different numbers, maybe we could figure out what's going to happen next.
I believe that would be the case.
And that's why they don't make them available to us.
That's right.
Do you have any of the old maps?
Millions of them are out there.
Do you have any yourself?
I have a few myself, but there are millions out there that they cannot recover because too many people have them.
Okay, well, let's tell everybody to ship a copy of their map to you.
Well, or to people who are interested in following this line of...
Mathematically inclined.
Yes, this line of investigation, right. So now we can move on to where is the attack. When you take a look at the very same location, there is a bridge that runs from Rikers Island to shore. And if you take a look at two angles that I've kind of bracketed with, one is 26 degrees heading and the other is 27 degrees, and the bridge runs right down along a line closer to the 26 degree angle. And my feeling about this is that that angle that bridge was constructed corresponds to a value of phi squared. Now, phi is a value like pi that recurs in nature, and where pi is involved with circular geometry, phi pertains to spiral geometry, and it has other mathematical qualities that make it very unique as well. The interesting thing is, you may recall that I mentioned the precession cycles earlier. Well, when you take a look at this angle that I'm discussing here at being 10 times this phi square value of 2.6180339874989, if you really want to take it out that far, and you multiply that phi square value times 432, you come up with 1131. Once again, the number of days between the African embassy attack and the 9/11 attacks. Okay, so there we have the correspondence between the geophysical core value that aligns with or is integrated with these other values that allow this to be a day for this occurrence. Okay, so, but in respect to this particular situation, we notice that this is at about a 26.18 degree angle. Okay, you could have made that bridge at any angle you would possible other than that and still accomplish the same thing. It's all just going to Rikers Island. All right. Now, if you take a look at that same angle And where you had a, let me find it here. It's hard to see here because we've got a lot of, we're stepped back very, very far. That angle that of the Rikers Island Bridge, and you draw that from this intersection of this line that runs from Fort Schuyler to Peterborough Airport in New Jersey. From that point and the intersection with the 322-degree Skull and Bones. It's not the Skull and Bones line. This is the Skull and Bones line, but this is a vector value corresponding to 322 degrees, which is the Skull and Bones signature. At that intersection, following the same angle as the Riker Island Bridge, excuse me, you come down to the Statue of Liberty. So the same angle that is established on the Rikers Island Bridge adjacent to the LaGuardia VOR is the same angle that this Pythagorean relationship defines going down to the Statue of Liberty. So we kind of come full circle there. Now the importance of that will become evident here in a moment. Going back to Rikers Island, we have these two high security buildings that are in a rectangular shape very near to this 322-degree line. If we draw a line parallel to the Skull and Bones Great Circle line, this big heavy yellow line, parallel to it down southward, and just remain parallel with this, on down through the New York regional area, we come to the footprint of Tower number 1 and Tower number 2. Okay? So why was there a construction project for the Rikers Island high security prisons to correspond to the same placement of the footprint at the other end of the island for the World Trade Center when it was constructed? Okay? This is a geometry and a architectural design not unlike the considerations that were put into Washington, D.C. with the Seal of Astroth. Okay? This is long-term planning on the part of the people who constructed the World Trade Center, namely the, think of their name, I'm sorry, the Rockefeller brothers, David Rockefeller. Okay? So when they decided where to place the World Trade Center, and whomever made the decisions to make the construction at Rikers Island, there was a mirror image of each other. And who was in Rikers Island on the very day of the attack? The Blind Sheikh, who was probably involved with organizing some aspect of that attack.
Well, he was involved in the 93.
He was involved with the 93?
93 and probably involved with 911 to a degree.
Well, I'm sure he could work things from inside.
Oh, of course they do.
And
they have a grapevine in the prison like you can't believe.
And prior to the 93 attack, the Blind Sheikh was intimately involved with the CIA and CIA operations in Afghanistan.
And trained by the CIA.
And closely associated with bin Laden. So
absolutely.
The Blind Sheikh was the direct communications conduit between the CIA and bin Laden. So here we have another astounding recognition of their signature. But the icing on the cake is this. When you take a look at this high altitude en route map and look at the designation for the LaGuardia VOR on the map, it has a label that indicates the frequency, and it has a Morse code that transmits all the time in the letters LGA, so that it identifies it to the pilot. And this particular label has some degree of arbitrary context as to where the map maker or the cartographer decides to place it on the map. Well, they have chose to place it on the map and use the pointer from that little balloon label in such a manner that it comes through LaGuardia VOR to the World Trade Center. That same line goes all the way down the East Coast to the Pentagon. That same line is defined by the pointer on this map. And that has always been that way. So this is not something that happened by accident. The people who make the maps, who put the VOR stations in their place, assign their frequencies, that was all controlled.
And what year you say? 1950s?
It's been a construction project since the 1950s. Yes.
So we're looking at 50 some years, 51 years.
Yes, and it's not just here in the United States, but there's evidence
Around
of it.
the world.
It's around the world. Because they're in control of the placement of these VOR stations and internationally as well.
And we're going to cover that in the next session.
That's right. So I hope that this has been an enlightening presentation, and hopefully it'll wake people up to the fact that although this is technical, it is understandable, and it is a matter of just taking the time to pay attention to these correlations that cannot be a possible random chance.
So you presented it in an outstanding manner, and I think all of us laymen can understand it.
I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. No question, and congratulations. And
Thank
thanks
you
very much for coming forward.
Thank you. Thanks.
God bless you.
God bless you. Thanks. Okay, that's it.